On today's show, shown even more so with the Juan Soto and Trent Grisham trade to the New York Yankees, the San Diego Padres are clearly trying to trim their payroll just a tad bit. So, in honor of that, let's talk about some lower tier, under the radar free agents on the batting side of things that the Padres should be targeting this offseason.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Friday, December 8th. As always, I am your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You may be familiar with some of my work over at Just Baseball. You could check that out. And also you could check me out on Twitter at Javipeno, Javiipeno, or at LO_Padres. If you want only tweets about the Padres instead of my, crap posting about movies and stuff like that every now and then. So go check that out. Today's episode, guys, is brought to you by FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's right. Big things happen over at FanDuel. Right now, customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. Just go check that out, FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And getting started with today's show, we got to talk about some free agents. We got to talk about on the batting side of things. I decided to split this up into 2 episodes. We're going to talk about pitching next week, along with relief pitching as well. Some lower tier, less than obvious free agents that the Padres could go after. There are some on here that make a lot of sense for sure, and I think a lot of people are probably familiar with them. And just looking at some other interesting ones that I'll quickly go through at the end that I don't necessarily think I'm all for, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some Padres hipsters might be, interested in some of those guys that won't cost nearly as much as anything, frankly, that I'm about to mention on this show. But I've said a lot on the show. I think Jung-Hoo Lee. I think he's the top, probably overall free agent that the Padres are after. Absent some crazy last-second turn and that they made up all this money, they cleared the cap space and they're gonna go after Ohtani, who is having a current I don't know if y'all know that guy who uses the he's the GeoGuessr guy. Everyone's kind of doing that cosplay on Twitter right now, guessing, oh, there's a flight from Anaheim to Toronto, he's going to the Blue Jays. Crazy stuff, and that's for another podcast about how media stuff and that works. But Jung-Hoo Lee is probably the top target for the Padres, but I'm not going to talk about him as much today because we did another episode on him, which you should go check out. This is assuming that the Padres, let's say, don't get him, and instead there are some other bats out there that I do think are interesting. This is not an exciting free agent class. In a lot of ways. It's very top heavy, and it is being headlined obviously by Shohei, and then you've got Cody Bellinger down there, someone who I think is very much out of the Padres price range, and is someone that, believe it or not, I remember saying last year, I was like, if they take a flyer on this guy, I wouldn't mind it. I just don't know where they'd fit him. I wouldn't mind him. I just don't know where they would fit him because they had Grisham in center field. I had no idea that he would now be the second biggest free agent overall from the class. And who else? And a player who we haven't really heard anything about, by the way. But anyway, you got him. You got some big pitchers like Blake Snell. You've got some big pitchers still out there like Jordan Montgomery being another one. But I think that when it comes to batters, there's a lot of people that feel like they fit in the same sort of bubble, right? A lot of just, sure, one of these guys that is currently a free agent that's not too old. I'm not talking about necessarily someone who's 39, or let me give you an example. I'm not talking about a Cole Calhoun or anything like that, or a Jackie Bradley Jr., right? I actually think those names are pretty obvious, but one of these guys is going to be good next year. This always happens. So while, yes, there's a lot of attention on the biggest free agents, given that the Padres already have some superstars, don't take this episode as a sign of, wow, we really got to go bargain bin scrapping. No, I actually think that if you play your cards right, one of these guys could be really good for the Padres this year. And especially since you already have superstars to supplant that, they just have to play like superstars, and the rest of the guys just have to be decent. So I think that there's plenty of interesting guys in terms of fitting that low budget mold. And I think that with the absence now of Trent Grisham and Juan Soto, 2 of your starting outfielders are now gone. So clearly, I would think the Padres are going to be targeting a lot of outfielders, and that's where this list mostly gears towards of players that I want to talk about, considering that they're both gone now, and I don't think that Jacob Marcy and Jose Azocar are going to get it done. I don't hate them as bench players, but I certainly don't like them as starting outfielders for a team that's got a huge payroll, right? So that's not going to happen, and I think that likewise, Jackson Merrill, right? Like, where does he fit into the whole free agency plans? If they decide to get a low cost, like if they decide not to go full board for a center fielder, maybe that's because they want to have Jackson Merrill potentially get called up, right? If they decide to go full force in center field, maybe he's not going to be called up, or maybe they'll play him in left field, whatever. So there's still so many variations on this. I just want to get that all out of the way. But enough talk. Let's get into it. I've been talking too much. First one we got to talk about is an obvious name, but nonetheless, he still needs to be talked about, and that's Kevin Kiermaier. Last year playing with the Toronto Blue Jays, he was excellent, and he's been a very good player for a long time. Don't get me wrong. His F4 totals are never going to blow you away, but that's because he should never be like the focal, like he should never, and I think that this happened a little bit with the Rays, where he spent most of his career. I think that what happened was he was like almost being asked, it felt like, to be like the lead person in Tampa, obviously until recently when they got guys like Randy Arozarena in the outfield, etc., right? But for Kevin Kiermaier, this is a guy who struggles with consistent offense. If you look at his offense basically every year, he's had like above average years. If you look at his second year with the Rays, 117 WRC plus. Like, he can do stuff. He can slug the ball a decent amount. He's a good counting stats guy, especially like back in the day when I was playing more fantasy baseball in that direction. Like, he was a guy that you would bet, okay, he hit 15, he had 10 home runs and had, 21 stolen bases, that type of thing. But then he'll follow that up with a 97 WRC plus. Then he puts together 104, 113. Then he has 2 years of a 79 WRC plus, right? He's not always consistently healthy. In fact, he's very much always not very consistently healthy. Aside from 2015, he's only played more than 122 games twice in his career, which isn't always great. Granted, that could be mixing and matching. Don't get me wrong. I don't know if he's always necessarily a full-time player. But this past year with the the Blue Jays, 2.2 F4 for the Blue Jays this year, and a 104 WRC plus. He had a 322 on base percentage, which was nice to see. Definitely capable of a walk every now and then, even if he, can be a little bit scary when it comes to the strikeouts, but a little bit down in the strikeout rate with the Blue Jays this year. 27.6% the year before, and then 21.1% this past year with the Blue Jays. 321 BABIP suggests that maybe he got a little bit lucky in that regard with some of the slash line stuff, but I like him. And again, just to emphasize how good he is with the defense, this past year, 18 defensive runs saved in center field and 13 outs above average. He is one of the premier defenders in the sport, and it would only make sense for them to target him. Hey, if there's a world where, right? There's a world where, just hear me out for 1 second. There's a world where they say, you know what, maybe we do some Kevin Kiermaier, kind of put him in center field. You have Tatis in right field. Maybe if they still want to go for like a high budget left fielder, or somehow maybe they move Jackson Merrill there, or they get Jung-Hoo Lee to go in the outfield and left field. I'm fantasizing here, but just say that out loud to yourself right now. Kind of exciting, right? Not too bad. So Kevin Kiermaier is one to look out for. My only thing is he's just such an obvious player that every team would want. Teams don't want him to be their only acquisition, right? He's one of those where it's like, to use a basketball analogy, right? Where it's kind of like if Chris Middleton was like if all my Bucks or NBA fans out there, like if Chris Middleton's your number one option, you're a little bit nervous about that. But if he's like your number 3 or 4, that's like excellent, and you're one of the best teams in the league. That's kind of Kevin Kiermaier, right? And I think the Padres clearly have enough star power in the outfield included, where I think that this would be really, really great. And potentially maybe you have Jackson Merrill get called up late in the season if anything goes wrong. Could take some reps there too. Maybe Kiermaier doesn't play every day. I would like it. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just Kevin Kiermaier. I spent a lot of time talking about Kevin Kiermaier, and we got plenty of other guys to discuss, so we will be getting into them. But first, ladies and gentlemen, let me just take a second to talk to you about our friends over at FanDuel. We love them so very, very much. And maybe you got the alert that the Puerto Rican legend, Isaiah Pacheco, is out for the Kansas City Chiefs. So maybe you're thinking, oh, I want to bet against the Chiefs. Or maybe you're going to zig when everyone else is zagging and you want to pick the Kansas City Chiefs now that they lost one of the big cores of their offense and a big core of my fantasy team, and the pride of my homeland in Puerto Rico. But in all seriousness, guys, if you want to bet on stuff, you got to go check out FanDuel. Customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. My personal recommendation would be the Jaguars. I think people might freak out about the Lawrence thing and maybe, shy away from him a little bit and start betting, who are they playing? Let me see here. Start betting the Browns. I think the Browns have shown that whenever they face a pretty good offense that they all of a sudden are giving up 30 points. Good team. Very good defense, very talented defense for sure. But I'd like to see a little bit less of you giving up 28 points to good teams. So that's just me. But you guys can go check that out. If you don't want to just make a money line bet, they've got you on player props, spreads, over-unders, and a whole lot more. So just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off your NFL season of betting. Remember, that is FanDuel.com/LockedOn, official partner of the NFL. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Locked On Padres podcast. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or the YouTube, Locked On Padres on YouTube as well. Thank you for giving the Soto video a lot of views. We'll definitely have more to talk about on that next week for sure as well, by the way. Let's keep the list going. We already talked about Kiermaier. He was pretty obvious. Just for some fan fiction for a little bit, how funny would it be if they brought back Tommy Pham? You know what I mean? That would be hilarious. And Tommy Pham is a pretty good player. But there is a very big vibe of I'm happy to be out of here type of thing. And not to mention that he hits, I think, 700 against the Padres. If you guys remember last year, he was hitting absolute nukes when he was on the Reds before he was traded away to the D-backs. Or I'm sorry, he went to the Mets and then he went to the... Hold on. He went to the Reds, then went to the Mets this year, was low-key pretty good for them, then traded to the Diamondbacks. But he hates playing against he hates the Padres, seemingly. He's our number one nemesis for some reason. But I don't think he's a target. I also think that he's just getting up there in age, 35 years old. And also, while I love his batting eye at the plate, this felt like a little bit too out of nowhere for my taste. In terms of, I don't want to say out of nowhere. He's been very good this year, but, he cut down on his strikeout rate, which was big. He's always been really good with just swinging at the right pitches. But I don't know, 110 WRC plus, he's not a plus defender. I don't know. It seems a little bit too obvious, and I think other teams are going to overpay for him, frankly. So wouldn't be interested in that. But one player I would be interested in is someone that I thought was the dream scenario at the deadline. That's Teoscar Hernandez of the Seattle Mariners. Look, here's the thing. It's an obvious player, but if you just want some power, if you want to try and reclaim what you got from Juan Soto, Teoscar Hernandez is a pretty decent bet for that. He's 31 years old, so he's not a young lad. He's been around the league for a little bit, but he's been around the league for a while to hit bomb after bomb more consistently than almost anybody. From 2018, here are his home run totals: 22, 26, 16 in 2020 in just 50 games, 32 the next year with the Blue Jays, 25, and then 26 this past year with the Mariners. I know he wasn't as good this year. His WRC plus went down significantly. 105 as compared to the 130, 132, and 142 of previous years. But there's just something weird that happened with that whole Seattle team in the first half this year. They all went super cold at the wrong time. He was striking out on weird pitches that he never strikes out in. But if you look at things at heat maps, in the second half, there were moments, actually months at a time, after the All-Star break, where he started striking out less in the places that he was striking out before, particularly up and outside, right? He wasn't really making that same level of mistakes as previously, right? And don't get me wrong, he's still a high strikeout player, but he balances that out with a whole lot of power, right? Last year, his isolated power was 178, and then the previous years, it was 224, 227, 280, 289. His lifetime career isolated power number is 225. So for me, what I'm seeing is for a historically not the easiest ballpark to hit, right? And just an offense that just seemed like it was really a mess basically the whole year with the Mariners, I'm willing to chalk up that Teoscar Hernandez just had a weird down year. And now that he's a free agent, I do think that teams are going to bid high on this guy. And he's not really a great defensive player. And yes, he primarily plays, or at least has played, right field, but he's played left field before. And he's been fine. You know what I mean? If you want to look at the last time he spent a decent amount of time in left field back with Toronto, in 250 innings, 0 defensive runs saved, +2 outs above average. Year before that, 0 defensive runs saved, -4 outs above average. So he's not great there, which leads me to my next point, which is I could see a world in which you could bring in Teoscar Hernandez and maybe another lower cost free agent, or heck, maybe Jackson Merrill, like if they call him up, and Teoscar Hernandez could be your DH. I think there's a world where that makes sense. Now, of course, it depends. He's a free agent. He won't want to necessarily do that, but I don't know. I just think that like Teoscar might not be horrible for the Padres defensively. And if you say, let's bring in Jurickson Profar to play left field, maybe they mix and match, do some clever lineup things. Maybe Mike Schilt can figure that out. Have Teoscar as your DH. I like that, especially if you're trying to replace the 35 home runs that you lost from Juan Soto. You can't replace Juan Soto, but if you're worried about, Tatis and Machado, like those guys are going to probably be your biggest home run hitters. And even Trent Grisham has a decent amount of pop. So you're losing that. Maybe the acquisition of Jung-Hoo Lee might scare people and say, will we have enough power on this team? Especially since Xander Bogaerts isn't like a super power guy. He's more like a doubles. He can still hit for power, but not necessarily home runs. So Teoscar Hernandez, I think, would make a decent amount of sense for this team. And heck, if he feels super comfortable in right field, I could even see the Padres moving Tatis to center. There's so many variables, and I think this is a good position, by the way, to be in. So Teoscar Hernandez, I think, would be really, really fun. The Padres have been desperate for some power for a while now, especially power that will show up consistently. So Teoscar Hernandez, not a bad target for the Padres. Another one. This is me taking a very victory lap. Given what we know now, and given that maybe you could have kept Soto if you didn't spend your money elsewhere, or at least you could have kept him for this year because you didn't have to shed payroll, man, maybe I was right on Matt Chapman. You know what I'm saying? Last year I said that if they don't re-sign Manny Machado, there are worse things to do than saying, let's just go and get Matt Chapman to fill in and be a decent player and then upgrade elsewhere. Not as bad. But anyway, in terms of actual options, there's basically no one for the infield. The only thing that could happen for infielders is it depends on what they do with Jay Cronenworth. And there's some interesting first base options. Rhys Hoskins, coming off his injury that made him miss the whole year. Carlos Santana, not bad, but he's old at 38. Brandon Belt, also old at 36 and has tortured Padres fans for years. And another guy, Garrett Cooper. We just had him last year. You guys know what Garrett Cooper is. I don't really have to explain it to you, but look, here's the thing. He's probably not going to cost that much. And if you do this mix and match approach, which I think the Padres might do, they might have a, give me 1 second. I'll land the plane. Give me 1 second. Cooper actually was pretty okay for the Padres last year. He started hitting for more extra base hits. It's just the factor of sometimes this happens when you're a midseason acquisition. Maybe you can't quite, get into a groove, but he could play first base and he could potentially DH. And then maybe you get one of those outfielders I mentioned before. So Garrett Cooper, if you want to go a platoon approach, also, as we all know, hits lefties very, very, very well. Garrett Cooper does. And he showed that, I think, a lot this past year and has always shown that in his career, frankly. If you look at his WRC plus numbers against lefties, let me just bring that up real quick. He had 145 against lefties last year versus an 80 this past year. So if you couple him with someone who's better at hitting righties, I could see that working, right? Like I could absolutely see that working. And I think that'd make a lot of sense for the Padres to look into. So just keeping that in mind, Garrett Cooper, we just had him here, but bringing him back wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, especially if you upgrade elsewhere and say upgrade on pitching, which we'll get to next week. So again, these are all sorts of options and variables. I'm just along for the ride explaining who I might like. Next player, I want to briefly touch on Joey Gallo. Similar to Matt Chapman and Tommy Pham, not actually options that I think the Padres should be actively targeting, but they've been obsessed with this guy for a while for a bunch of reasons. Primarily because of trades. I remember this, guys. I remember when CJ Abrams and Robert Hassel is what the Rangers might have wanted for Joey Gallo. Now, granted, at the time, in a vacuum, not the worst trade ever. When that was happening, which was, I believe, around like 2019 or 2020, He had a 3.2 F4, consistently a 3-win player. He had great defense and a 144 WRC plus. That's what they were asking for. And of course, the Padres very wisely did not do that and instead waited. And now, if they want to, they can pick him up for a couple bucks. 104 WRC plus last year, but he hit below 100. Or I'm sorry, wow, no, he wouldn't be in the league. He hit below 200. Still solid WRC plus. He hit 21 home runs. He's got the power. But for me, here's why he's a no. I know the strikeout rate clearly ended up being like, this is just not sustainable. I don't care how much power you're hitting for. You cannot strike out this many times and expect to stay in the league. 34.6% strikeout rate, 39.8%, and then 42.8% strikeout rate this year. There's two reasons why the Padres can't do this. Although I think that it's possible they might be interested in because of Preller's, reluctance to move on maybe from Ranger stuff back from his days with Texas, and also because of just all the reports that they were trying to trade for him back in the day. He's regressed defensively, which is the thing that makes me fear signing him the most. He was genuinely like a Gold Glove caliber outfielder at one point, particularly in right. 13 outs above average in 2020, or I'm sorry, 3 outs above average and 13 defensive runs saved in 2020. 2021, basically the same thing. 12 defensive runs saved, 6 outs above average. He had it, man. He had it. And then they started trying him out elsewhere. Did not do well in left field. He's not that great of a defender elsewhere. And if he's not giving you that plus defense, then I don't want him. Because I don't want to move Tatis out of right field. Are you kidding me? Why would we move him out of right field? Especially if it's not a guarantee that he'll translate to center or left. I'd rather keep our platinum glove player over there who also is a great batter. Right, so even in a down year, he's better than Joey Gallo. So I don't like that for the Padres. I could see them doing it and getting desperate trying to replace Soto's power, but I'm not trying to have Trent Grisham vibes again. Good defensive player who does nothing with you almost when it comes to the bat, right? The only difference is that Gallo's power upside is a lot higher. So I'm not into that, although I imagine some people might be. Before we get into the last bunch of players that I want to talk about, guys, we're going to take a quick break and hear a couple words from our sponsors. And these last ones I think will be very fun for Padres fans who have been listening to the show for a while. So stay tuned after a couple messages. And just like that, we are back here. Locked On Padres, activated, boom, boom, pow. We are killing it. And here we go. Last bunch of players that I want to recommend the Padres go after. We already talked about a few on this show that I don't necessarily love, right? And I was just talking about because of the vibes and because of the potential and what have you. Last one that I want to talk about that is a vibes guy is everyone's favorite, and that's Jurickson Profar. For whatever reason, the vibes are immaculate with this man, and it would not cost anything. Keep in mind, he was not very good last year, Jurickson Profar. And I was just mentioning earlier, let's say they decide to go big and maybe get a Teoscar Hernandez, which I would love. I'd be very excited about that. You get power there, and maybe you want to put him in left field, and then sometimes you put in Jurickson Profar. He was not good last year, though. Let me emphasize this. -2 F4. But that's like so negative that I'm not buying it. He's not going to be a negative player like that again, right? I don't know what happened. He waited too long to sign. He just wasn't hitting well. 76 WRC plus was the worst that he's had in years. But if you're just a vibes believer, you could get this guy for nothing and be a bench player that you can plug in on days that, Teoscar doesn't want to play left field or when Teoscar is playing DH, whatever it is. Like, I could totally see that for Jurickson Profar. So I'm here for the vibes. And for whatever reason, inexplicably, the team seems to play better when he's on the team. And him and Tatis seem to get along well. So he's definitely the ultimate bargain bin. Like, bring him back for nothing. He could be a little bit better than, say, your, Matthew Battens of the world. Oh, Batten actually was hitting a little bit at points last year. I'm not going to lie. He was hitting a little bit. But a little bit better than your Adam Engels. Like, at least it feels like, hey, maybe you want a chemistry guy. We were told by San Diego media for so long that chemistry was important. That's why they kept Hosmer. So I'm pretty sure we can find a way to be like, oh, well, Jurickson Profar for chemistry. Especially for, like, $2 million? Right? Like, I don't think this guy is going to be going for much. So I could see that actually shaking out, but we'll see. Next one we got to talk about is, speaking of vibes, this would be a full-time DH, and he is the type of player that, with all the ridiculousness that's been happening with the Padres, all the weird rumors, all the clubhouse stuff, I think that he is the definition of a savvy veteran. A little bit of an obvious name, but he had a really nice bounce back season last year. Andrew McCutchen. He's old, 37 years old, but his vibes are also great. And he slashed 256, 378, 397 with the lowly Pirates last year. Good for a 115 WRC plus, 1.2 FWAR. If you want to go bargain bin hunting, Teoscar's going to cost a lot more. Andrew McCutchen for like a year as like this veteran presence in a clubhouse that might need it. You know, you're bringing in Mike Schilt. I would like that. I think that there would be like a calming sort of thing to having Andrew McCutchen on this team, who probably has more winning experience officially now, dare I say, than anyone on the team. I'm trying to think. I guess Joe Musgrove technically when he was with the Astros, but like Andrew McCutchen he's been through it all. He's been in a bunch of playoff scenarios, and it wasn't his fault the Pirates were bad last year. So Andrew McCutchen I could see being very solid, but the risk with him is years before that, very average player. He can't really, doesn't have the same speed anymore, certainly. And he doesn't have that same level of, you could put him in the outfield, right? And he only played 112 games this year, so health could be a factor, but I'm just saying, I think that you could do a lot worse with him as one of your DH players. That being said, I could also hear the comments already saying, this feels very Nelson Cruz, this feels very Matt Carpenter. Savvy, good veteran player who had a good season, and you just bring him in for that, and then he ends up taking one of your spots, especially since he'll probably be DH only, right? That'll be a problem, where it's just like he'll just be stuck languishing away on the bench, the same way Matt Carpenter kind of was for a lot of these years, and certainly the same way Nelson Cruz was. So I see that, but just in terms of him having a good year, and I think this team could use a player like that. So I'm interested in Andrew McCutchen. We've only got 3 players left that I want to touch on. Really quickly, Adam Duvall. Not the best player in the world, certainly, but he's had moments where he's flashed defensive brilliance out in right field primarily. So I like him for that. If you look at advanced fielding metrics, again, when he played right field, let me see. Was it right field or was it left field? Give me one second, guys. It was left field, actually. My apologies. I was wrong. I'm discovering this now. He's had some really underrated defensive seasons. Let's go from 2016. 17 defensive runs saved, 3 outs above average. 2017, 11 defensive runs saved, 6 outs above average. 2018 with 2 teams, 16 defensive runs saved and 8 outs above average. Then he took a little bit of a dip with defensive runs saved. And then 2021 with 2 teams, 6 defensive runs saved and 1 out above average. This is a guy who would basically be Joey Gallo when it comes to the type of player he is, except will probably be a lot more consistent. 303 on base percentage last year. He hit 247, so he's got a little bit better batting average, 116 WRC plus, and has shown that he can be more recently a much better defender. So I actually think that Adam Duvall could be really fascinating, especially since left field is very much open. So Duvall, with that power upside, he gets hot too. This is a guy that will go in streaks. I don't think he's going to hit 38 home runs again like he did in 2021, which was absurd, by the way. I don't think he's going to do that. But 21 last year with the Boston Red Sox, I could see it, man. I could see it. I really could. Not to mention that I think that overall he's been a lot more steady of a player. So Adam Duvall is one that I really, really like. And again, he's shown defensive upside there before. He is getting older, so he might not be able to be like a Gold Glove defensive run saved guy, but he's been really underrated with that for a while now. And that's probably why he's stayed in the league, because despite his streaky annoyingness, could be a really quality defender. So that's someone I'm interested in as well. Next player, this would also be a DH only type of scenario, and it would be predicated on what else the Padres do. I know you guys might not like this one, but Jesse Winker. That's right. Here's the thing. Lefty bat and can hit righties really well. So you might see where I'm going with this. Say they do a Garrett Cooper, say they do a Jesse Winker, or say they do a, Robbie Grossman, who also hits lefties quite well. You have someone who hits lefties well. You have someone who hits righties well. Jesse Winker, I don't think he's an amazing bat, which is why I would prefer someone like the aforementioned Adam Duvall. He was really bad last year with Milwaukee. 65 WRC plus. I don't know what the heck happened there. That's weird. And it's not like that ballpark is impossible to hit in, but he's had some good offensive years before, and he's still only 30 years old. So, or at least he's going to be 30. 108 WRC plus in a down year with the Mariners, then 148, 142, 111, 127, 134. He's had good offensive seasons, but holy God, is he bad defensively. So if the Padres were to acquire him, you need to make sure you have a backup plan. In left field, in his last full time there, -16 defensive runs saved, and negative 10 outs above average. Wowza! That is atrocious. So again, Jesse Winker would be a guy that if you mix and match correctly and you have him along with somebody else, similar to what the Padres tried to do at this year's deadline, if you hit him against righties, he hits righties really, really well. He's got good splits in that regard. Last year, not as much. Probably shouldn't look at that, but for his career in general, he's been quite good against righties. 129 WRC plus as opposed to an 86 versus lefties. That's always been his problem. But if he's like a DH that you bring in every now and then, because of how he had 2 straight down years, 1 down year with the Mariners and 1 atrocious year with the Brewers, you could probably get him for next to nothing in the grand scheme of things. And if you pair him with another signing for another outfielder or DH, et cetera, then I wouldn't mind this as a potential option if you're really going bargain bin hunting, right? Maybe bring in Lee to play center field, and then you have a Profar Winker type of situation going on. That's a lot of players I just mentioned, but you follow me, okay? You follow me. You get what I'm saying. I kind of like the idea of the Padres doing that. But again, I would hate if they ever have to play this guy defensively because he's terrible. But I'm looking at the fact that he's not going to cost anything, and he hits well against righties. So I would like that a lot. Last player to mention, I already mentioned him, Robbie Grossman. I've been obsessed with this guy for years. I like the fact that only Juan Soto and a few other players are better than him at avoiding really bad chase rates and bad pitches. He was okay at points for the Rangers, but other problem with him, not the best defensively, right? He's just not the best defensively, and I don't know if he would fit in this Padres outfield, right? Last year in left field, -3 defensive run save, -3 outs above average. So that's his problem. And I don't think he fits necessarily as a DH. So again, Robbie Grossman would be like a last ditch, bargain bin type of player. So I'm not totally interested in him, but I thought it was worth mentioning only for the fact that I've been interested in him for years. And he doesn't chase. And I like guys that don't chase. Just when it comes to trying to find, you're not going to find power at the bottom of the barrel necessarily. Like, you're not going to find cheap power as much as you can find cheap on base percentage. So I think he's like a almost like the worst case scenario instead of like a Mark Canha, right? Mark Canha, who I have also loved, and I am realizing now that I never mentioned him on this list. He's another guy that I would be really interested for the Padres. Let me quickly wrap up with him. On top of being a really big foodie and a big fan of posting on his Instagram about food, I like Mark Canha. Last year, along with the rest of the Mets, really, really bad. But then he went to the Brewers and turned it around a bit. And if you look at his years since 2018, one of the most consistent outfield bats in the sport, from 2018 to 2023, 115 WRC plus, 146, which was clearly a bit of an outlier, then 129, 116, 126, 111. He also has a pretty good eye at the plate. He gets hit a lot by pitches, as people may know. Good walk rate. He actually struck out less this year, which is kind of cool. And he walked a little bit more. So again, I think that he kind of turned it around. He just had a very weird stretch with the Mets last year, along with all the rest of their players, by the way. Absent Francisco Lindor, everyone got worse on that team this year. So that would be it. So let me just quickly summarize all the players I think the Padres should actually be targeting for real. Kevin Kiermaier, Mark Canha, Teoscar Hernandez, Andrew McCutchen, Jurickson Profar, depending on what else you do, Jesse Winker, Garrett Cooper, and Adam Duvall, I would argue, is my favorite because of the cost out of all of these guys. I really do believe that. I think he could be really awesome. I really do. I've liked this guy for a long time. Part of it is feeling. But again, if you don't have a lot to spend, I wouldn't mind spending on someone who could just give you some really good OBP. And I know he doesn't have a lot of power, not like Adam Duvall. So kind of be like, pick which one you want, right? Mark Canha doesn't do as much defensively. Adam Duvall has shown some strength there. They're both a little bit old, but they'd probably be only 1 or 2 year guys. And frankly, I think the Padres should be prioritizing decently, these aren't bad deals, especially when you have superstars already, but those middle tier short-term contracts, I think they should do that route. Do a little bit of mercenary digging. You know what I mean? Even if it's just for 1 year, I think that could be good because you could get the best year out of anyone for just a year. So again, just to reiterate one more time, some targets I think for the Padres: Kevin Kiermaier, Mark Canha, Teoscar Hernandez, Jurickson Profar, Jesse Winker, Garrett Cooper, Adam Duvall as the serious ones that I think they should be looking into. And Winker, again, I know he's bad defensively. You'd have to get someone else. But again, And there's plenty of other guys out there. And again, I don't know what's going to happen with Jackson Merrill. Heck, I don't know what's going to happen at first base. That's the biggest question mark. If they trade Jake Cronenworth, do you go after CJ Cron, Trey Mancini after a down year? That could be an interesting one. He's been very good before. I wouldn't want to go for Brandon Belt because he gets hurt too much. Rhys Hoskins is the obvious, like, prove it guy. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see, guys. But that's just me waxing poetic, talking way too much about some offensive batters that I think could be really good for the Padres next season. Let me know your takes in the comments or DM me on Twitter or whatever, at me on Twitter, both accounts, and I will be listening intently. The same way we're all listening intently to figure out where the heck Shohei Ohtani's finally going. But with that all being said, everybody, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast. The only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or at LO_Padres, or Locked On Padres on the old YouTube. And until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My Friar Faithful homies, look forward to next week when we talk about pitching.